Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch my inquiry project, Trauma-Sensitive Youth Services in Literature. This project is intended for librarians who serve children and teens in the public library setting, but many findings are helpful to anyone working with the same population in a variety of settings. My name is Sarah Lucas. Over the course of my career in high-poverty school environments and the public library setting, I've developed an interest in trauma-sensitive teaching techniques, and I believe that they would significantly benefit children's librarians in the public setting. I really couldn't articulate this interest until after watching the documentary Paper Tigers, which documents a group of teachers attempt to connect with high-risk students in an urban setting. And I watched this during a screening at Central Library. After watching Paper Tigers, I thought to myself, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to help kids like this, and I actually could be good at this. Now, as a budding children's librarian in a public library, I found a perfect setting for my purpose. Librarians offer resources and services to an extremely diverse population of people on a daily basis. I would argue that the majority of the people that frequent the public library have or are currently experiencing trauma. There is no reason for me to believe that the children in the library are not going through the same things. Things like homelessness, abuse, hunger are likely issues that children and teens are facing, as librarians are interacting with them with all of the best intentions. The objective of this inquiry project is to better serve young patrons who have experienced trauma, to help librarians recognize symptoms of trauma in children and teens, to create activities and programs that support social and emotional learning, which from now on I'll refer to as SEL, and to sensitively recommend appropriate youth literature to young patrons who may have experienced trauma. To start my inquiry project, I decided after some deliberation that the Alberta inquiry model would be best in my pursuit of trauma-sensitive youth services in literature. I learned that this happens to be a very natural way for me to organize my learning process. And during my planning process, I use that time to decide on a topic after reaching out for advice from my manager and talking to some of my coworkers. In the retrieving part of this inquiry process, I spent time collecting articles from library databases and creating a to-read list of books by mental health professionals and educators. During my processing process, I annotated articles and attended an SEL conference that allowed for discussion. And in the creating process, I decided to create a video after consulting with peers about the most digestible way to get this information. And my intent is to share this video on YouTube and make it public and then share it to my class's box. And after this project is over, I plan to add the edited video after comments from my peers and from my professor to my portfolio. In between the planning and retrieval process of my inquiry model, I came up with 3 initial questions to guide my research. They were, how can librarians use their skills and available resources to help children and teens in need of social and emotional support as a result of trauma? What are the most effective strategies for communicating with kids and teens who've experienced or are currently experiencing trauma? And what role can youth literature play in serving kids and teens who have experienced trauma? What I found were ways to recognize trauma in children and teens, trauma-sensitive ways to approach and talk to young patrons, social and emotional programming, or SEL programming, and trauma-sensitive readers advisory, and a growing book list. By the age of 11% of children have experienced a traumatic event, and by age 18, it jumps up to 43%. For a librarian, it is best to assume that nearly half of the teens she sees have experienced an event that has affected their social and emotional development. The symptoms of trauma are restless, anxious, and irritable behavior, A heightened startle reflex, a child that's abnormally jumpy, or one that has frequent outbursts, or self-isolating, reclusive, and antisocial, with that's obviously fear-based behavior. This information reminded me of a quote that I heard early in my teaching career that still sticks with me today. The quote is, "The children who need love the most will always ask for it in the most unloving of ways." Russell Barkley said that, and he is an expert in ADHD, but I find what he says to be so relevant to the topic of trauma. The symptoms of trauma are behaviors that an adult might instinctively want to reprimand or even find cause to call a library security. But no kid is a bad kid. Chances are they simply have lost or haven't learned appropriate social responses to an adult trying to talk to them. And that brings me to my next finding, approaching young patrons. These strategies for approaching a young patron who displays symptoms of trauma are best for an initial encounter. On an average day, it's rare that a librarian is able to spend enough time to really establish a relationship with a child or teen. Consider these strategies a stepping off point to establish yourself as a safe person. And remember that some behaviors may be considered unlikable. They may be taken as rude, or remember, one of the symptoms of trauma is outbursts. And while I'm going through this list of strategies, I want you to think about this quote. "Nothing other people do is because of you. When we take something personally, we make the assumption that they know what is in our world, and we try to impose our world on their world." So the first thing that you need to do when approaching a young patron who's displaying symptoms of trauma is to speak calmly and with kindness. Make it clear that you're a safe adult with intentions only to help. Let them know what your job is and how long you'll be available. For example, I'd say, "My name is Sarah, and I'm the teen librarian. I'll be in this area until 2 if you need anything at all." And then maybe give them the name of the person that's coming up after you. You should be visible and available. Any clerical tasks can wait, but a child in need may only be willing to ask for help once. I suggest being general with pronouns. Don't say things like, "Excuse me, young man," or "Hello, young lady." The patron may react negatively to those gender-specific greetings, especially if they struggle with gender identity. And then provide passive guidance to resources. I've provided a picture here of a sign that's at Central Library in the teen section. It says, "Teens, help yourself." And then it's a list of tough topics that teens might be looking for. Things like incest or abuse or drug addiction. And then it gives them the Dewey Decimal Number to be able to find that book on their own. So this negates the need for them to work up the courage to ask someone in person. And then you as a librarian can be there to observe, just to offer support, just in case. One of the great resources I found was information provided by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. This information was provided during a conference I attended about library services for teens that encourages social and emotional growth. The conference was hosted by YALSA and inspired me to connect what I learned to what I knew about trauma-sensitive teaching practices and library services. I learned that it's essential to keep these 5 social and emotional learning elements a priority for planning programs, but to consider that the need for it is great for children and teens who've experienced trauma. If you take a look at the circle, the 5 elements are self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. On the outside of the circle, you'll see home and communities, schools, and classrooms. Children and teens who have experienced trauma may be lacking this home and communities part, this protective layer to these social emotional learning elements. Here is a graphic provided at that conference that breaks down each element of SEL. This has served as sort of a checklist when I plan programs to make sure SEL is happening in the program design. The last part of my findings is Reader's Advisory. And I learned, first and foremost, that you need to know the books that you plan to recommend. I wanted to show the book Winter Girls by Laurie Halse Anderson as an example of a book that I highly suggest reading thoroughly before recommending. Upon an initial search, this appears to be a teen novel about surviving an eating disorder, but I'd argue that this is a book that needs to come with ample adult support, or else it can be a trigger to unhealthy responses. You need to respect the patron's decision to pursue a genre or specific title. Never steer a teen or child away from something that they're interested in. Think egalitarianism when determining book tastes. A child or teen who may have experienced trauma is likely to struggle academically, so they may prefer high interest but low level books. So remember that all reading has value, whether it be low, whether it be high. If they're interested in reading, that is success. And then lastly, suggest downloadable content to support anonymity. If they want to learn more about eating disorders but don't want their friends seeing them reading a book about it, if they have a downloadable book, they're keeping it to themselves. Here are the professional connections I made with my inquiry project. This information could be a possible required training for librarians in the future. It'll help make more meaningful relationships with young patrons. It would create a higher amount of attendance at programs because more teens or children are comfortable being at the programs. Librarians can now know how to act as models for healthy responses to stress and social interactions. And then awareness of trauma results in reaching more young patrons and actually helping them. So those deeper connections. As for me, this inquiry project validated my current practices. It helped to increase my mindful and purposeful interactions with patrons. And then it reinforced my purpose for working in children's services. I knew this is where I wanted to be, and now I have some information and some resources to really back me up. I have here a handful of books I recommend to professionals or caregivers of children and teens who may have experienced trauma. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, Fostering Resilient Learners, The Deepest Well, and this author, Nadine Burke Harris, has a brilliant TED Talks that you can watch on YouTube. I highly recommend listening to her because she is very passionate about what she does. And the last book here is called The Four Agreements, and I actually provided a quote from this book earlier on in this video. This is a great one just for some self-care and some self-improvement to keep on your nightstand just in case you're having a rough day. Here are 3 recommended reads for children: Crenshaw, Wolf Hollow, and Just Under the Clouds. They're all on the topic of traumatic events, and they really gently guide patrons through these tough topics in an empowering and really meaningful way. And here are 3 recommended reads for teens: What I Leave Behind, ID, and Burn Baby Burn. Just like the books I recommended for the children, these are all on the topic of traumatic events, but they are a gentle, empowering way to overcome adversity. And that just leaves me with my bibliography. You can take a look here for all of my resources I used during my inquiry project. I hope you learned something. I hope you found this useful.